You think the American Civil War was decided by General Lee and battlefield glory? Think again. We are pulling back the curtain on the Great Reckoning. This was not merely a military conflict, it was a final, cataclysmic collision between two incompatible empires, the relentless industrial North and the brittle aristocratic South, built entirely on human bondage and a fatal flaw. In this deep historical dive, we are exposing the systemic collapse that doomed the Confederacy before the first major battle was won. We are talking financial ruin. We reveal how the South's economy was choked by its own flawed ideology, leading to 9,000% hyperinflation and desperate women rioting in the streets of Richmond for bread, complaining they were fighting for the rich man's Negro. We expose the unseen architects of freedom, the ironclad duel that instantly rendered every wooden warship in the world obsolete. The tragic untold Second Battle of Gettysburg, where 36,000 wounded men were triaged and left to die in the woods, and the 180,000 black soldiers who seized the musket, validating Frederick Douglass's promise that by fighting, they earned their right to American citizenship. This war didn't just save the Union, it gave us the 14th Amendment, the constitutional bedrock still governing your rights today. If you want to understand the true price of freedom and the economic logic behind the greatest tragedy in American history, you need to listen to this. Don't go anywhere. Let the reckoning begin. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss our deep historical dives, and let's unlock the true story of the U.S. Civil War, the economic crucible, and the birth of a modern nation. The Great Reckoning, an American tragedy of industry, empire, and constitutional redemption, 1861 to 1865. The unbridgeable chasm, slavery, secession, and the Republic's original sin. The shots fired at Fort Sumter in April 1861 were not merely the opening salvo of a civil war. They were the final, cataclysmic release of a fundamental structural and moral tension that had been suppressed since the very founding of the United States. By the mid-19th century, the American experiment had bifurcated into two utterly incompatible civilizations. The North had forged a dynamic, rapidly industrializing and commercial society rooted in free labor and a fiercely held conviction that the vast Western territories were the birthright of ambitious white farmers and laborers, places where the blight of slavery must not be allowed to spread. The South, conversely, existed as a powerful but ultimately brittle agrarian empire. Its wealth was concentrated within the plantation system, an economic model often described by historians as the factory system applied to agriculture, whose entire existence relied upon the forced labor of enslaved people. This dependency granted the South formidable, if fragile, economic influence. King cotton, alone, accounted for an astounding 60% of all American exports by 1860. This powerful planter elite had successfully conflated their entire aristocratic lifestyle and prosperity with the perpetual subjugation of African people. Disarming the myth of states' rights, the tenacious historical narrative, meticulously crafted and propagated by the lost cause ideology, which claims the conflict was fought purely in defense of abstract states' rights, does not withstand critical scrutiny. An examination of the secessionist declarations reveals that the crisis ignited over one single, unresolvable demand: the right to protect, expand, and perpetuate the institution of slavery into the new territories of the Republic. Southern politicians were not fighting for autonomy in the abstract, but for the fundamental right to own human beings as property. In a striking rhetorical contortion, advocates for secession claimed that slavery was essential to white democracy. Henry Wise of Virginia argued that the principle of slavery is a leveling principle. It is friendly to equality, asserting that by excluding black Americans from the political sphere, white citizens achieved a greater parity among themselves. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, representing the anti-slavery Republican platform, served as the ultimate political trigger for the 11 Southern states to secede. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln clearly laid the ultimate responsibility for the impending bloodshed at the feet of the secessionists. "In your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war." 2. The reckoning of industry, technology, command, and asymmetry. The dual presidency, Lincoln versus Davis. The initial confrontation between the two rival presidents, Abraham Lincoln of the Union and Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy, seemed to favor the veteran. Davis was the quintessential Southern patrician and professional soldier, a West Point graduate and military hero. Lincoln, the self-taught frontier lawyer, appeared ill-equipped for the role of commander-in-chief, initially struggling with strategy and hindered by the indecisiveness of early commanders like General George McClellan. Yet it was Lincoln who exhibited the superior strategic evolution and political genius. He mastered the mobilization of the industrial North's overwhelming resources. Davis, constrained by the Confederates' underlying political philosophy, which championed states' autonomy and distrusted strong central authority, failed to impose the necessary centralized financial and industrial controls required to fight a modern, protracted war of attrition. Lincoln's slow but steady ascent to strategic clarity, culminating in the radical moral declaration of emancipation, ultimately sealed his opponent's fate. The iron cage of logistics. The Civil War was the world's first truly industrial conflict, and its outcome was fundamentally decided by the North's superior logistics and capacity for production, a devastating asymmetry of resources. The industrial disparity, 1861. Metric Union, North Confederacy, South, ratio advantage-free population base, 22 million, 5.5 million, 4-to-1 industrial production value, greater than 90% of national total, less than 10% of national total, 9-to-1 usable rail mileage, approximately 70% of national total, approximately 30% of national total. 2.3, 1 enslaved labor force 0 to 3.5 million, sole basis for wealth. Экспортировать в таблице. The Confederacy, tied to its massive fixed investment in slave labor agriculture, could neither develop nor afford the centralized industrial and financial system required to sustain a modern mechanized army. The convergence of rail and wire transportation technology played a decisive role. Railroads, which General William T. Sherman recognized as critically important, allowed for the rapid movement of troops and supplies at speeds never before seen. The North possessed a relatively integrated network, while the South's lines were disparate, short, and often employed different track gauges, forcing catastrophic delays in transshipment. The telegraph, running alongside the rails, provided unseen speed in communication, allowing the federal government and military command to react and take action much faster than had ever been possible. The birth of the modern Navy. The naval confrontation achieved an immediate global impact. The March 1862 Battle of Hampton Roads, pitting the Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia against the Union's USS Monitor, was a tactical draw, yet its strategic consequence was revolutionary. It instantly proved that wooden warships were obsolete, fundamentally changing worldwide naval strategies overnight. The Union's massive industrial capacity quickly pivoted, ordering 56 more monitors, thus assuring the long-term effectiveness of the naval blockade. The decisive blows of July 1863. Although the Civil War contained numerous pivotal moments, the events of July 1863 constitute the point of definitive strategic no-return for the Confederate rebellion. Gettysburg, July 1st to 3rd. General Robert E. Lee's final desperate attempt to win the war on Northern soil was decisively repulsed, extinguishing the Confederacy's last viable chance for a military victory or a negotiated European peace. Vicksburg, July 4th. The capture of Vicksburg, Mississippi, secured the Union's complete control over the Mississippi River, effectively slicing the Confederacy in two and opening the critical Western theater for sustained campaigns. This victory set the stage for Grant's success at Chattanooga in November 1863, which, according to some historians, truly opened the road for Sherman's final campaigns. The tragedy in the town of Gettysburg. Beyond the heroic narratives lies the devastating Second Battle of Gettysburg. The struggle for life waged immediately after the combat ceased. The tiny village of 2,500 civilians found itself instantly inundated by 36,000 desperately wounded soldiers. Overwhelmed surgeons were forced to grimly triage the wounded, separating those with a realistic chance of survival from those likely to die. Scores of the latter group were carried into nearby woods and laid in rows, where, semi-conscious, they were left moaned and twitched painfully while waiting alone for the end. A Union surgeon described the scene as an occasion of the greatest amount of human suffering known to this nation since its birth. 3. The South devours itself, class warfare and moral isolation. The Confederacy's ultimate demise was hastened by internal social and economic collapse, which relentlessly undermined the facade of monolithic white Southern unity. Ghost money, starvation, and the bread riots. The central failure of the Confederate government was financial. Its relentless printing of approximately $2.25 billion in unsecured paper money unleashed uncontrolled, runaway hyperinflation that officially surpassed 9,000%. As the monetary system collapsed and the crucial rail network crumbled due to neglect, catastrophic food shortages swept through southern cities. This crisis ripped open the deep-seated class fissures in the Confederacy. The slave-owning elite often hoarded necessities or paid poor white farmers with worthless government certificates, while speculators drove prices to exorbitant levels. Fighting for the rich man's Negro. The most visceral evidence of this class hatred was the series of bread riots, culminating in the massive disturbance in the Confederate capital, Richmond, on April 2, 1863. Starving working-class women whose husbands were at the front stormed commercial stores demanding food. Their letters revealed profound resentment, complaining that their men were fighting for the big man's Negro, underscoring the belief that the war benefited only the slaveholding elite. The Richmond elite, desperately clinging to the myth of social harmony, refused empathy, instead blaming the rioters on outsiders and social outcasts. The reckoning of cotton diplomacy. The Confederacy's entire foreign policy rested on the assumption that cotton diplomacy would force Great Britain and France to intervene, believing that European textile mills could not function without Southern supply. This assessment was catastrophically flawed. No major power granted the Confederacy formal diplomatic recognition. While Northern diplomacy was effective, the core failure was moral. By the 1860s, global moral condemnation of slavery, an institution one historian described as our American Holocaust, outweighed European economic necessity. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, secured foreign popular opinion against the Confederacy, permanently removing any legitimate moral justification for European intervention and isolating the rebellion internationally. 4. The Unseen Architects of Freedom, Emancipation, and Equality, Lincoln's Climactic Decision. Lincoln methodically sought the constitutional justification for ending slavery, viewing it as the great moral cancer of the nation. His Emancipation Proclamation, issued January 1, 1863, was a strategic declaration of military necessity, freeing enslaved people only in the states currently in rebellion. This decision became the critical pivot, transforming the war from a mere effort to save the Union into a fight for a new birth of freedom, a phrase Lincoln later consecrated at Gettysburg. The Union Army became an army of liberation, actively encouraging thousands of enslaved people to escape, simultaneously crippling the South's agricultural labor base and bolstering the North's ranks. The U.S. colored troops, the claim to citizenship. The proclamation immediately opened the door for massive recruitment into the U.S. colored troops, USCT. By the end of the war, over 180,000 African American men, including more than 94,000 former slaves, had served in the Union Army, constituting 10% of its total strength. Despite enduring pervasive racial prejudice, unequal pay, and the heightened danger of execution by Confederate forces, the USCT proved their valor repeatedly at engagements like Port Hudson, Fort Wagner, where Sergeant William Harvey Carney became the first African-American Medal of Honor recipient, and New Market Heights. Their service was an undeniable, bloody claim to civic rights. As the towering abolitionist Frederick Douglass declared in 1863, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder, and there is no power on the earth or under the earth which can deny that he has earned the right of citizenship in the United States." Women. Defying the Victorian citadel. The demands of the Civil War shattered the rigid constraints of Victorian femininity, requiring unprecedented public and battlefield contributions from women, both black and white. The Secret Army. The war generated a secret army of female combatants. Conservative estimates suggest that between 400 and 750 women disguised themselves as men to serve on the front lines for both armies, their true identities only revealed by injury or death. Albert Cashier, born Jenny Hodgers, fought in over 40 engagements with the 95th Illinois Infantry, and Sarah Emma Edmonds, who served as Franklin Flint Thompson, served as a nurse and spy before earning the unique distinction of receiving a veteran's pension after the war. Others, like Loretta Janetta Velasquez, served the Confederacy as both soldier and spy, sometimes utilizing a fake mustache to maintain her guise. On the home front, figures like Harriet Tubman served the Union as a spy, scout, and nurse. Clara Barton later founded the American Red Cross. Thousands of women mobilized through the U.S. Sanitary Commission, USSC, an organization described as the Union's other army, gaining organizational experience and political skills that proved indispensable to the post-war women's rights movement. The Constitutional Reckoning, from Civil War to Civil Rights. The conclusion of the war preserved the Union, but launched a constitutional revolution that permanently shifted the balance of power toward the federal government. The Second Founding. The 3 Reconstruction Amendments provided the new legal charter for American citizenship. The 13th Amendment, 1865, formally and unequivocally abolished slavery throughout the United States. The 14th Amendment, 1868, declared African Americans to be full U.S. citizens, directly overriding the Dred Scott decision, 1857. Crucially, this amendment radically expanded federal power at the expense of state autonomy, requiring states to guarantee equal protection under the law to all citizens. The 15th Amendment, 1870, secured the voting rights of African American men. The enduring legal shockwave. The 14th Amendment is more than historical text. It is the legal cornerstone of modern American democracy. Its due process and equal protection clauses are the most heavily litigated parts of the Constitution, forming the legal basis for landmark Supreme Court decisions from Roe v. Wade, 1973, to Bush v. Gore, 2000, confirming that the Civil War's legislative legacy continues to govern the nation's destiny. The delayed payment of a debt. Despite the revolutionary scope of the amendments, the promise of equality was tragically undermined by the failed Reconstruction period. By the close of the 19th century, the legal framework of Jim Crow and widespread racial discrimination had relegated African Americans to a codified second-class status in the South and beyond. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was, therefore, not a new struggle, but the long-delayed fulfillment of the promises made during the Civil War. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 explicitly relied on the constitutional authority of the Reconstruction Amendments, forged a century earlier, to finally dismantle legalized segregation and pursue the goal of substantive equality. Conclusion. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, was a monumental reckoning. Though commenced by the South to preserve an agrarian empire based on human bondage, it was transformed by the overwhelming force of the industrial North and the moral necessity of emancipation into a crusade for a new birth of freedom. The Confederacy's collapse was a preordained tragedy rooted in its brittle economic structure and fatal political philosophy. The war's true heroism was found in the unseen, the enslaved who escaped to become soldiers, earning their citizenship in blood, and the women who shattered social constraints to serve. The legacy of this bloody conflict endures in the Constitution, providing the ultimate legal charter that guides the nation's ongoing and still unfinished struggle for true equality. We've just scratched the surface of how the economic catastrophe of 9,000% hyperinflation and the sheer tenacity of the U.S. colored troops truly reshaped the Republic. Now, I want to hear from you. Which forgotten hero? Was it the women soldiers who defied Victorian norms, or the industrial genius that drove the ironclads? Do you think history has most overlooked? Drop your thoughts and share your own deep knowledge in the comments below. If you want more critical analysis and historical deep dives that uncover the untold history of empires and constitutional turning points, make sure you smash that like button right now. And the most important thing, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the Great Reckoning and beyond. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of story.